Well, it's time for the monthly video critique. Theme 15 was panning, and well, there was only 2 submissions this month, and I considered not doing the video, but then I thought the images have a lot of similarities, and I thought it would be interesting to compare those, discuss what makes them the same, what makes them the different. The system I'm going to use is does it fit the theme? Both images do. I will cover some artistic aesthetic considerations and of course the technical considerations, with panning being fairly technically challenging. Alright, the first image we have is by Paul, and had downloading disabled on Flickr, so I did a screen grab, stole the image for here, and used a 24-105 at 51 millimeters f4.5, which is almost wide open. f4's max on that lens. 1/60th of a shutter speed and ISO 6400. Right, ISO 6400 on a 7D is pushing things, and we're going to see that has affected the image. f4.5, honestly, stop down 0.5, not really enough to make a difference, but being open to f4 probably wouldn't have made much difference either. 1/60th of the shutter speed, that's getting pretty low, so that's going to be more demanding. Otherwise, I don't see anything I would necessarily change. Couldn't stop down for more sharpness. ISO would get too high. ISO lower, shutter speed would end up lower, making things more difficult. So I don't really have a problem with the settings here. If we look at the image, as far as the amount of background blur goes, it's adequate. There's enough. Now, there's a few things to consider here. The speed of the aircraft. Now, due to the angle of the pan here, it appears that this aircraft is landing. It's either landing or taking off. But since the slope here is downward, I'm assuming the pan is going slightly downward, so I'm assuming landing. And for an aircraft this size, that's 150, 180 knots, 200 miles an hour, somewhere around there. That's pretty fast. But a couple things that affect the relative speed of the aircraft. One is distance. At 51 millimeters, I don't believe this filled the frame like this. I believe there's a lot more room, because you'd have to be pretty awful close, and if you were that close, this 200 miles an hour, there would be a lot more motion blur to the background. So I think this is, about a half, 50% crop or so. And as such, aesthetically, I would rather see some more room in front for landing. Maybe even a little more room to the rear. I generally like to see 3 sides about equal as far as spacing from the subject. I don't want it tighter on one edge or 2 edges. And I think a little more environment, a little more of the background blurred, would give a little more sense of what's occurring. So we have distance to the subject. The further away it is, the slower it's going to be moving. The slower it's moving, the less motion blur you get. Okay, so it's either distance away or magnification, focal length. So we have a shorter focal length and probably a longish distance, which is slowing down the relative speed of the aircraft, making our pan relatively short, even though this is doing about 200 miles an hour. Then we have the other consideration is the distance of the background from the subject. The closer together they are, if I'm following the aircraft, then the background's moving faster in relation to the aircraft. I'm panning to keep the aircraft stationary in the field of view, which makes the background move. The closer it is to the aircraft, the background is to the aircraft, the more blur I'll get out of it. I'm guessing that a bit of these lights are a pretty good distance beyond the aircraft. So this background's not real close. So those have combined to create a shorter panning blur, even though we have an aircraft that's moving about 200 miles an hour. Just guessing. Right. F4, almost wide open. It's not going to be the sharpest. ISO 6400 is going to cause a bit of noise, going to degrade sharpness. Lack of light is going to degrade sharpness. And being blue tends to generate noise on all sensors regardless of the ISO, and that's going to degrade sharpness somewhat as well. And because we have the blue, we have less contrast here, so that camera's going to have a little hard time focusing. So all these things are going to contribute to making this more difficult and resulting in a less sharp image. I don't think that panning motion is necessarily the issue. I'm going to go to the next. I did a 100% crop here. We look at this front wheel in this text. I can read it. These panning lines, they're very straight. So it means the panning action was well established and smooth. Great job there. So our lack of sharpness that we see here are not due to technique, they're due to conditions and the resulting camera settings. So we've got the blue noise in there to be expected, a little lack of sharpness. And we could address those things. And with this image, I would start by getting rid of the noise. That would be my first point. I'll just knock that way up. And we can increase the amount of detail it pertains and bump the contrast up. And you'll see that, let's get rid of some color noise as well, because you can see this has got some red speckling and stuff in there. We should be able to get rid of quite a bit of that. Alright, so that's where it was before, that's where it's after. Let's add a little sharpening, and let's mask that off so it's only affecting edges. And we end up with that there. So not a big difference, we've just mostly gotten rid of the noise. We can zoom in. That's after the fact, before. And this is a little pixelated from being a screen capture, or just, I'm not exactly certain why. But before, quite a bit of noise everywhere. Afterwards, less noise, and not any worse really on sharpness. So I would probably start out at that point for the image. Alright, so we can do something similar here. Mask, luminance around there, detail, contrast, color. So something in there where we were. Alright, other than this, we could add some clarity to the image. That is mid-tone contrast, and that will increase the appearance of sharpness. We might not want it everywhere. In this case, I don't really mind it everywhere. And we could treat the white balance on the plane by turning taking the blue off the plane. We get a greater contrast, which is going to create a greater sense of sharpness. But because the plane is pretty much the same color as the sky, our whites are all pretty much the same color, it's a tedious little bit task here in Lightroom. So I went ahead and I did that already, and I'll turn it on. And you can see that that has increased the sense of sharpness because it has increased the contrast. So there's my mask, and these are the settings. I've got additional clarity set on the aircraft, and I've got the white balance set here to take away some of that blue. And if I wanted to take away more, I can right click here and hit duplicate. Alright, so Right, there it is. It duplicated again, got rid of a little more. The reason I'm suggesting putting layering the mask there is because the masking is so tedious. Do it once, do it accurate, and then you can just duplicate it, and then I can change those settings. So the second layer there, I can take the clarity away, or I can just set it to 0, and I can adjust this area, or I can go in and I can erase some of that, set our flow down around 50, and I can erase some of it from this area where I don't want it affecting as much to kind of equalize it out. So I actually have 2 here. I can drag one off. You can see my mask moving, and I just put it back, Command Z. So if it's something difficult like this, I recommend masking it once carefully and then duplicating it as opposed to redoing that every time. But you can see that by making the plane wider, we've gotten rid of a little bit of a sense of evening. So maybe you don't want to get rid of as much as that. But it has increased the sense of sharpness because it has increased the contrast. So somewhere in there, maybe we'll just get rid of this one. Delete that one. Let's just have the one. Leave it in there, something like that, which is a little better than without, in my opinion. Still left enough sense of evening. It's obviously evening, you got the lights and the sky. This just helps a little bit in my opinion. Like I said, the only thing, little edits, and I would probably compose this a bit looser, giving that plane some room in the front and convey a bit more of a sense of situation, what's going on. Okay, our next image is by Glenn, and here we have another airplane, and we have a similar amount of motion blur, interestingly, because this plane is either on cruise or taking off, not sure, but this type of plane is probably doing somewhere around 80 knots, 100 miles an hour, somewhere in that range. So it's doing about half as fast a speed, and we've got twice as fast a shutter speed. So half as fast a subject with twice the shutter speed, and yet I've got a similar amount of motion blur. Now I actually have about half as much motion blur. Either the shutter speed would explain that, or the subject speed would explain that. But together they don't explain it. So it comes to those other factors. So the two things that are making a difference here is primarily distance to the subject. I believe this was taken closer and it's less of a crop of the image. So the distance to the subject has created a greater sense of speed, and the distance from the subject to the background has increased that relative speed between the two, giving us this amount of motion blur. Personally, I would rather see more motion blur, but this is again a situation where it gets very difficult. In the previous image, we have a jet, and in a jet, there's really nothing of the jet itself to blur. So panning in our shutter speed selection is only for background blur. Whereas with a prop plane, we have the prop. And somewhere in the 1/125 to 1/250th range, even as 1/500, depending upon what's going on, is going to be the right shutter speed for the prop, because this is spinning fast. It's a small radius, and it's spinning fast, and the shutter speed has caused it almost to disappear. There's almost no hint of it. So here, for the prop, a little faster shutter speed would have been beneficial, so we'd get more of a sense of the propeller, but that would pretty much eliminate the background blur. So in this case, I think the 1/125 is about the right choice. I'd rather see a slower shutter speed for the speed of the aircraft versus the background to get more background blur, but that would further negate the prop spin. And for the prop spin, I'd rather see a slightly higher shutter speed. You just have to balance everything out. With this image, we're at f8, ISO 100, 90mm f2.8 macro lens, sharp, 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 and there's nothing that really should hurt this at all. Let me undo that, get rid of that brush so I can zoom in. And when you look at this up close, I can read the text, P2010, the type of aircraft this is. So it's plenty sharp, and settings account for that. The only other things, looking at this, the panning motion, it's slightly climbing, but it's smooth, and the image is sharp, so it tells the panning technique was well done, the motion was well established, fluid, and follow through has all worked well. It also says this aircraft's probably taking off. If it's not taking off, it's getting closer. At this angle and this shutter speed, I don't think it's getting close enough to cause that upwards panning motion. So I'm guessing it's taking off. And with a prop aircraft that's taking off or landing, the prop speed is going to vary. So the shutter speed that's going to be optimal is going to vary as well. So we're trying to balance background blur against prop blur. So on takeoff, he's probably got this thing at full throttle, so the prop's going to be spinning as fast as possible. Whereas in cruise, it'll be going slower, and on approach, it would be going slower, possibly, as he feathers it back. It varies all the time. So with a prop, whether it's airplane or helicopter, you tend to look for something around 1/125, 1/250th as a start point. And depending upon what they're doing, landing, taking off, maneuvering, it's going to vary. And another interesting thing with a propeller is if you get exactly perpendicular to it, so that you're looking at the edge of the prop, it will show no matter what the shutter speed. It will become just a solid line. So you always want the prop at a little bit of an angle so you can get a bit of that blur to the prop. And that's what's happened here. So for this image, only thing I would do differently, technique-wise, nothing. The white plane against the white clouds, the lighting has allowed it to stand out. None of it's lost except for a little bit of the prop, so I don't have a problem with that. It's mostly clear of the background trees, and the background trees are what's really conveying the motion, because if we look, you have the motion here, a lot less back here at the clouds because of the distance. The clouds are so far away, they're relatively stationary. Trees are closer to the plane, they've got a faster speed. So we need the trees for that. And if the plane was in front of the tree, the prop with little motion blur, prop blur we can see would go away because it would be dark on dark. So compositionally, everything, I really don't have an issue. I might like to see the plane just a little more clear of this and a little less heavy on the lower area, so the plane just a little bit higher and then the whole frame shifted up, but you don't always get those choices. For this image, if it were me, I would take it into Photoshop, I would separate the background out and blur it further because I couldn't get exactly what I wanted when I took the shot. And I did that to give you an idea. I took it into Photoshop, applied a little bit of linear motion blur, and now that plane looks like it's going real fast. And in fact, it kind of looks a little bit like it's pasted in there. If I were to be more critical of this, I would go in and remove that motion blur from the clouds, most of the clouds, because that's what's causing it to look excessively fake. Separate it out, I did a motion blur, but I just did it uniformly to the whole thing, and that's what's causing it to look fake. I need to add a graduated mask to this so that the added blur is heaviest up front and then fades to nothing at the distance as distance increases. Alright, so 2 images, well executed. The only comments I can make about them are just pretty much situational. And when you're panning, it's always a balance. Background blur, compound motions, speeds, and distances. And along with distances, magnification. So we can call it effective distance or size within the field of view as captured prior to cropping. Those are all going to affect what you get when you're panning. And that would be it for this month. So until next month, my name is Stephen Kirsting, and I will see you then.